The night was quiet in the small-town diner, a place where the neon sign flickered and cast a soft red glow across the parking lot. It was the kind of spot locals went to for comfort food and familiar faces, a place where laughter and coffee cups filled the air. Inside, at a booth near the window, sat an elderly woman. She was black, disabled, and frail, but carried herself with dignity. Her grey hair was tied neatly back, her glasses perched on her nose as she carefully studied the menu. She had lived a long life of struggle and perseverance, and this diner was one of the few places where she felt safe. The waitress greeted her warmly, knowing she was a regular. "How are you tonight, Ms. Johnson?" she asked with a smile. The woman nodded politely, replying in her soft voice that she would like her usual fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea. But the peaceful evening was about to be shattered. The door to the diner swung open, and 5 young men barged in. They were rowdy, loud, and dressed in hoodies and jackets that gave off a menacing aura. Their eyes scanned the room, searching for attention, almost daring someone to challenge them. Customers grew quiet, their forks pausing mid-air. The waitress tensed but forced a nervous smile, hoping they would just sit and eat like everyone else. But these weren't ordinary customers. They spotted Ms. Johnson sitting alone. Their smirks widened, as if they had found an easy target. Whispering to each other, they sauntered toward her booth, their footsteps heavy against the tiled floor. One of them leaned against her table. "Well, what do we have here?" he sneered. "Grandma out all alone at night." The woman looked up, unfazed by the mockery. She had lived through worse than insults. But her hands trembled slightly, a sign of the fear she kept buried beneath her calm exterior. Another thug reached for her plate, laughing as he tried to grab a piece of chicken before she could even touch it. "You don't need all this, old lady," he mocked. The others erupted in cruel laughter. The diner grew tense. A father eating with his kids whispered for them to look away. The cook clenched his jaw but stayed behind the counter. People wanted to intervene, but fear chained them to their seats. The thugs began to escalate. One of them shoved the woman's walker aside, knocking it to the floor. The loud clatter echoed through the diner, sending a shiver down every spine in the room. "Ms. Johnson gasped, clutching the table for support. "Please, don't," she whispered. But they weren't listening. One of them leaned closer, his voice dripping with cruelty. "You don't belong here. Why don't you just stay home where you're supposed to be?" His words cut deeper than the shove, reminding her of the prejudice she had faced all her life. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness but from frustration. Frustration that even in her old age, she was still a target of hate and disrespect. But what the thugs didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Her son had just walked into the diner. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the build of someone who worked hard for a living. He had come straight from a late shift at the factory, still wearing his work boots and jacket. His eyes immediately locked on his mother, trembling in fear as these 5 men circled her. For a brief second, his heart froze. But then, something inside him snapped. The thugs didn't notice him at first. They were too busy taunting the elderly woman, laughing and jostling each other like schoolyard bullies. But as he stepped forward, his boots hitting the floor with a deliberate echo, the laughter began to die down. "Get away from my mother," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the entire diner. The thugs turned to face him, their bravado faltering for the first time. There was something in his eyes, fierce, unflinching, and ready to protect at any cost. One of them tried to laugh it off. "Oh, so this is your mama. You gonna do something about it?" But his voice cracked slightly, betraying his fear. The son didn't respond with words. He simply stepped closer, his presence enough to make 2 of the thugs instinctively take a step back. The diner watched in breathless silence. Everyone could feel the tension thickening, like a storm about to break. One thug made the mistake of shoving him. The son barely moved, standing firm like a wall. Slowly, he leaned in and whispered, "Touch her again, and you'll regret it." Suddenly, the false courage of the group began to crumble. They had expected an easy victim, someone defenseless. They had not expected a son with fire in his eyes and the strength to back it up. The leader tried to salvage his pride. "Let's go, man. This isn't worth it," he muttered, pretending it was his choice to leave. But everyone in the diner knew the truth. They were afraid. The thugs shuffled toward the exit, muttering curses under their breath but never daring to look back. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the diner in stunned silence. The son immediately rushed to his mother's side, gently helping her pick up her fallen walker. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked, his voice softening with concern. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from relief and pride. "You came just in time," she whispered. The waitress hurried over, her hands still trembling. "We should call the police," she insisted. And indeed, someone had already dialed 911. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the diner windows. Officers entered, taking statements from witnesses and reassuring Ms. Johnson that the men would be found. But what struck everyone in that diner wasn't just the crime that had almost happened, it was the power of a son's love. Every customer who had stayed silent, paralyzed by fear, now felt a wave of guilt and admiration. They had seen how one man's courage could change the course of events. As Ms. Johnson and her son prepared to leave, the diner erupted in applause. It wasn't just for him, it was for her too. For her resilience, her dignity, and her strength. The son held his mother's hand as they walked out together, the night air cool against their faces. She leaned on him for support, not just physically but emotionally, grateful beyond words. "Thank you, my son," she whispered. "You've always been my protector." And he replied, "Always, Mama. Always." The story of that night spread through the small town like wildfire. People spoke about it in hushed tones at work, in schools, and at church. It became more than just a diner incident, it became a reminder that evil thrives when good people stay silent, but it only takes one act of courage to turn the tide. Ms. Johnson continued to visit that diner, but she was never alone again. Her son made sure of it. And whenever those who had been present saw her walk in, they remembered the night she was nearly broken, and how love and bravery froze 5 thugs in their tracks. The memory stayed with everyone, a living testament to the strength of family, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. And the diner returned to its usual rhythm, laughter, coffee cups, and warm meals, but with a newfound sense of unity. Because everyone who witnessed that night knew they had seen something unforgettable, the moment fear turned into respect, and cruelty was silenced by love. The night had begun like any other in that little roadside diner. Couples laughed softly in their booths, truckers sipped on hot coffee after long miles on the highway, and the jukebox played a tune from another era. It was the kind of place that made people feel safe, a rare comfort in an uncertain world. Ms. Johnson, however, wasn't there for nostalgia. She was hungry, tired, and carrying the weight of her years. Her body had betrayed her long ago, leaving her with limited mobility, but her spirit was unbroken. She leaned on her walker, moved carefully to her booth, and sat with a sigh of relief. The waitress, who knew her by name, brought her water before she even asked. "It's good to see you tonight, Ms. Johnson," she said warmly. The elderly woman returned the smile, grateful for kindness in a world that often overlooked her. But that fragile sense of safety was about to be shattered. The diner's door opened, and 5 figures stormed in, laughter spilling out of them like smoke. Their energy was different, not the laughter of joy, but of cruelty, the kind that made everyone uneasy. Their eyes scanned the room like predators searching for prey. They didn't come for food. They came for power. At first, they shoved each other and made crude jokes, throwing their weight around to make their presence felt. But when the gaze landed on Ms. Johnson, sitting alone at her booth, everything shifted. Their smirks widened. To them, she looked defenseless, a victim waiting to be humiliated. One of them leaned over her table, knocking her silverware aside. "What's a crippled old lady doing here by herself?" he jeered. His friends cackled, feeding off the cruelty. "Ms." Johnson's hands trembled. She had endured decades of discrimination, survived hardship most of these boys couldn't imagine, but in that moment, she felt small. She whispered, "Please, just leave me be." Her words only fueled their mockery. Another thug grabbed her walker and tossed it across the floor. The loud crash silenced the entire diner. Forks paused midair, and whispers died. People watched in shock, torn between the urge to act and the fear of what might happen if they did. The men crowded her, their shadows falling across her frail body. One pretended to steal food off her plate. Another leaned so close she could smell the alcohol on his breath. Their laughter rang cruelly in her ears, a reminder that some people found pleasure in breaking others down. And then, the door opened again. Her son walked in. He was exhausted from his shift, his face lined with sweat and dirt, his shoulders heavy with responsibility. But the moment he saw his mother cornered, something inside him ignited. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a raw and fierce determination. At first, the thugs didn't notice him, but the sound of his boots striking the floor made them glance up. Their laughter faltered. Something about the way he carried himself, the quiet strength, the controlled fury in his eyes, unnerved them. He spoke only once, "Step away from my mother." The entire diner froze. His words weren't shouted, but they cut sharper than any scream. The authority in his voice was undeniable, the kind of tone that made grown men hesitate. The leader of the group tried to play it cool. "And what if we don't?" he asked, forcing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. The son didn't flinch. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, his eyes locked on theirs. The air thickened. The walls seemed to shrink. Every customer held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. One of the thugs shoved him lightly, testing him. But the son didn't move. His feet were planted like roots, his body steady like steel. "I said," he repeated slowly, "get away from my mother." The tension was unbearable. Even the jukebox seemed to stop. The thugs exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, doubt flickered across their faces. They had expected an easy target, an old woman with no defense. They hadn't expected a son like this. Still, pride kept them from backing down immediately. One of them muttered something under his breath, trying to save face. But when the son leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough for only them to hear, their confidence cracked. "If you lay another finger on her, I promise you, you will regret it for the rest of your life." The words hit harder than any punch. The threat wasn't empty. They could feel it in the way he stood, the way his eyes never wavered. This wasn't a man who bluffed. And then, it happened. One of the thugs took a step back. Then another. The leader cursed under his breath, but even he knew it was over. Slowly, awkwardly, the group shuffled toward the door. The diner exhaled collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath at once. The son rushed to his mother's side, lifting her walker, steadying her trembling hands. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked, his tone suddenly gentle, a stark contrast to the steel he had shown moments before. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "You always come when I need you," she whispered. The waitress hurried over, her hands shaking. "I called the police," she said quickly. And indeed, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. The thugs hadn't gotten far. Officers intercepted them just outside, cuffing them as the crowd inside the diner watched from the windows. Justice was swift that night. But what everyone remembered most wasn't the arrest. It was the moment the son stood tall, unshaken, in the face of 5 aggressors and turned the tide without throwing a single punch. The other customers felt a pang of guilt. They had sat frozen, afraid to intervene, but this one man's courage had been enough to protect the vulnerable. It was a reminder of what true bravery looked like. As the police statements were taken and the chaos settled, the diner slowly returned to life. People whispered about what they had witnessed, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The son helped his mother back into her booth. She insisted on finishing her meal. "I won't let them take this from me," she said firmly. Her resilience was unshakable. Her son smiled, proud. "That's the woman who raised me," he replied. When they finally left, the entire diner applauded. Strangers who had been silent now stood, clapping not just for the son, but for Ms. Johnson herself. They weren't just witnesses to an incident, they were witnesses to a bond stronger than fear. Outside, under the cool night sky, Ms. Johnson leaned on her son's arm. The neon sign flickered above them, but its light felt warmer somehow, as if the world itself was nodding in approval. "Thank you, my son," she whispered. He looked down at her, eyes soft. "Always, Mama, I'll always be here." The story spread quickly across town. People repeated it at barbershops, churches, and workplaces. Some exaggerated the details, turning the son into a larger-than-life figure. Others spoke of the shame they felt for not stepping in. But all agreed, it was a night that changed the town. Ms. Johnson became something of a local hero, not because she fought back, but because she endured with dignity. Her son became a symbol of courage, the man who reminded everyone that love and loyalty can turn fear into silence. Weeks later, when she returned to the diner, the waitress greeted her with a hug instead of a hello. Other patrons offered to pay for her meal, a small gesture of respect. She accepted graciously but reminded them, "The real blessing is my son. Don't forget that." The thugs, they faced charges, but more than the legal punishment, they faced humiliation. Their story wasn't about dominance anymore, it was about the night 5 bullies were frozen by one man's courage. The diner lived on, the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes returning to normal. Yet, for those who had been there that night, every sound, every meal, carried the memory of what they had witnessed. The night wasn't just about danger. It was about triumph, about love, about a son's vow that no matter what, his mother would never stand alone. And so, the story lived on, not in headlines, not in police reports, but in the hearts of those who had seen what happened when evil thought it had power, and love reminded it that it never truly did.